Throughout the second half of World War I, the United States issued billions of dollars in loans to the European allies so they could continue purchasing weapons. However, once the war was officially over, the US demanded that Europe repay its inter-ally debts in full. The United States' demand destroyed the global economy. Germany spiraled into hyperinflation as it flung more and more of its currency onto the foreign exchange markets in an attempt to make its reparations payments, which had been set miles above its capacity to pay by the European allies because they couldn't come up with enough money themselves to pay off their debts to the US. The hyperinflation devastated the German economy, wiping out the middle class and clearing the way for fascism to seize power. At the end of the 1920s, the stock market imploded when the massive bubble fueled by decisions taken to keep the inter-ally debt payment service afloat finally popped. Finally, the US's demand plunged the entire world into the Great Depression. Given the scale of destruction and how it would change the world, it's worth asking, could this all have been avoided? Economist and professor Michael Hudson examines this question in his book, Imperialism: The Economic Strategy of American Empire. His analysis is incisive and eye-opening, so in today's video, I'll be breaking down his research and conclusions on who caused this collapse and what was the United States really after. In the eyes of the German government, a debt was a debt, and debts must be repaid. Throughout the 1920s, suspending reparations payments was barely even considered. In fact, Germany's political parties competed against one another for who could come up with the way to make reparations payments on time. The European allies also worked tirelessly to pay off their debts to the United States, though, Professor Hudson adds, quote, "This is not to say that they were blameless in their relations with Germany," end quote. France, for instance, went on a bit of a vindictive streak. Britain protested after French troops occupied the Ruhr in 1923, to which the French government, headed by President Raymond Poincaré at the time, rejoined, quote, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," in strict accordance with the precedent established by Germany in 1871, this being the indemnities France had to pay after losing the Franco-Prussian War. The Ruhr district will be released only when Germany pays. The Reich must be brought to such a state of distress that it will prefer the execution of the Treaty of Versailles to the conditions created by the occupation. End quote. Quoted from Carl Bergman, The History of Reparations. The French government went on to add that German resistance must end unconditionally, without compensation, that Germany's capacity to pay fluctuated too much to pin a number to, and even if the German government agreed to an amount, it would just deny it the next day. Besides, nobody had cared whether France thought the Treaty of Frankfurt that ended the Franco-Prussian War just and within its capacity to pay. The treaty had required France to cede the most of Alsace-Lorraine and pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs within 5 years. So why care about what Germany thought? And Germany's capacity to pay was supposed to be investigated by impartial experts. Who did they need to be selected by in order to be, quote-unquote, impartial? That was France's position on the matter. While the Allies did extort every ounce of tribute from Germany they possibly could, it all came down to the US's demands that they repay their war debts in full, interest included. Professor Hudson concludes, quote, "Because the US government was the ultimate claimant on all war debts, the failure to achieve a realistic solution to the transfer problem must be attributed to US policy." End quote. The US had double standards, and it wasn't towards who do you think. Thanks to the Dawes Plan, Germany didn't need to fear its reparations payments going up due to a fall in world commodity prices against the dollar/gold. The Dawes Plan gave both the German government and the Reparation Commission the right to request a revision if the general purchasing power of gold changed by not less than 10%, as compared to its value in 1928. Any revision would stand for the next year. Then either party would again be able to make a claim for a new revision if the gold value had changed by not less than 10%, as compared to the year the latest revision had been enacted. To sum things up, this part of the Dawes Plan recognized that the reparations fixed were the maximum amount the Allies could squeeze out of Germany, which also exceeded Germany's capacity to pay. This meant that any increase in the real value of reparations debt would, by definition, impoverish Germany until it was completely nationally exhausted. The Dawes Plan protected Germany from the terms of trade turning against it when commodity export values changed, but the gold mark reparations stayed the same. On the other hand, the US wouldn't condescend to even consider what would happen to the inter-Allied debts if world prices fell, the flip side of which was a rise in the value of gold when measured in commodities. Britain, because in the end it all came down to Britain, wouldn't be able to repay the inter-Allied debts. The real value of British debt would rise if commodity prices fell, but Germany's direct and indirect debt to Britain would basically stay the same. Something very strange was happening. US government policy was to protect Germany, its recent enemy, and leave its associate, Britain, on the chopping block. But why exactly would the United States do something like this? When we zoom out to see what was really at play here, the United States' motives become clear. At the time, Britain was the world's dominant imperial power, and Germany the recent challenger for that title. As Professor Michael Hudson explains, the argument is justified that the United States wanted what the British Empire had for itself. Quote, "To swallow the empire, the United States must first dislodge it." End quote. Britain couldn't be allowed to use a victory to regain its strength. Germany needed to be propped up once again as its rival. The same policy was used after World War II. In the end, the US's only real rival was the British Empire. World debt would be weaponized and its power used to chip away at what stood between it and imperial supremacy. Britain was on the hook for making sure the United States would get paid, regardless of whether Germany, whose reparations were the basis of the inter-Allied debts, could pay. That brings this episode on the American Empire's economic strategy to a close. If you're interested in pulling back the curtain on how the money underpinning US global power works, I highly recommend checking out Professor Michael Hudson's Imperialism, the Economic Strategy of American Empire. This video is part of an ongoing series breaking down Professor Hudson's phenomenal book. If you want to understand the money that turned the United States into what it is today, from what the US did to rise to economic power to how it funds its empire, you can't miss it. In the next video, we'll take a look at what happens when governments try to resolve the inter-Allied debt problems once and for all. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.